Beware of Strangers by Chris Harvey. It was in the newspapers again, or at least the local ones, and it had been promoted to the front page. She could see it in large black letters right in front of her as the young man sitting opposite unfolded his newspaper. Fears of a serial killer increase as victim number 3 is found. It was so close that she could read the small print of the story if she wanted to, but she didn't. The train slowed as it approached another station, and she shifted her gaze from the newspaper and looked out of the window. It was already pitch black outside, even though it had only just gone 6, but then it was the middle of February, so there was nothing too unusual in that. As the train squealed to a halt, the station lights broke the infinite blackness, and she could see the platform, could make out the nameplate of the station. Then the train was still, and she could hear the clunk of metal on metal as doors were opened. There weren't many passengers boarding, but quite a lot were getting off, and she watched as they dashed eagerly towards the steps, keen to get home and out of the bitter chill of the night. Then the train was moving again, and she watched the station disappear, treacle blackness replacing it once more. She sighed and closed her fingers tightly around her handbag, returning her gaze to the interior of the train. If only she brought a magazine to read. She hated staring face to face with those sitting opposite. She never knew where to look, and it made her feel uncomfortable. She scanned around and noticed that there were quite a few seats empty now. A few minutes earlier the train had been packed with many people standing, and it had felt quite claustrophobic. It was as she was about to look out of the window again that she saw him staring at her. She hadn't even noticed him before, but now he caught her eye, and for a moment she locked eyes with him. He was sitting at the end of the seat opposite, watching her through narrowed eyes, a wry smile upon his lips. A ripple of unease trickled through her body, and she returned a weak smile, but this only caused him to sneer more, and his eyes flicked down her body and back up again. She turned away to look out of the window, but her eyes only met his reflection, a perfect copy in the glass, still staring and smiling, and she didn't like the look of him at all. He was the stereotypical thug, skinhead, spotty face, unshaven, and dressed head to toe in camouflage gear. She cringed, repulsed, and snatched her eyes from the window and to the man sitting opposite reading the newspaper, his identity hidden behind the broadsheet. She recalled when he had got on and remembered that he had seemed a decent sort, finely groomed and looking very smart in his light and expensive, she guessed, suit. Desperately she tried to think of an excuse to talk to him. But what could she do? How could she attract his attention? The train began to slow yet again as the next station loomed, and she could feel the thug's gaze burning into her. Her mind raced to find a reason to speak to the smart man with the newspaper. And then, as if he had read her very thoughts, the man lowered the newspaper and peered out of the window. He narrowed his eyes as if trying to make out where he was, and then he noticed that he was being watched. Seizing her chance, she smiled as blatantly as she could, and after a moment of bemusement, he smiled back. Just wondering where we were. His face reddened slightly. It wouldn't be the first time I've overshot my station through reading. I get so engrossed I forget where I am. She smiled again, immediately feeling the tension being sucked away. Not only was this man smart and decent, but he was quite attractive too. She felt immediately at ease. She had broken the ice. She was about to ask if she could look at his newspaper when, to her utter surprise and relief, the thug stood. She watched as he moved to the doors, couldn't believe it when the train pulled into the station and he got off. The man with the newspaper watched her, his face creased with bafflement. "Are you all right?" He seemed concerned. The train started up again and she heaved a sigh. Now it was her turn to feel embarrassed. But within a couple of minutes she had explained all about the thug staring at her, had told him how she had tried to think of an excuse to speak to him. He laughed, and he certainly didn't mind. "No, you can't be too careful these days. A frown had replaced his amusement. Nobody's safe anywhere anymore. He pointed to the headline on the front page of the newspaper and rapped it with his finger. It's a bit too close for comfort, isn't it? Terrible business. She nodded and winced. I can't read it. It gives me the creeps, especially when I'm out at night on my own. She shivered for effect. Well, you don't know who's lurking around, do you? He shook his head. There was a brief silence, but the young man soon broke it again. So, aren't you going to tell me your name then? Denise, she told him. His eyes lit up. Denise? That's a nice name. Mine's Anthony, but my friends call me Tony. Well, it's nice to meet you, Tony. They talked for the rest of the journey, and their confidence grew with every second. There was nothing to worry about with this man. It had started to rain quite heavily when they got off the train, and Tony didn't have much of a problem tempting her into joining him for a drink and a bite to eat. They stayed in the fast food restaurant for over an hour, chatting and laughing and enjoying each other's company. It was still raining when they finally left, and, opening up his newspaper, Tony held it over their heads as a makeshift umbrella. There was a bus shelter just outside, and they eagerly ducked under it, seeking refuge from the downpour. There was very little awkwardness between them now. Do you know something? I don't remember ever seeing you on the train before, she pointed out, a little curious. I can't recollect seeing you either, but what? He smiled broadly. Well, it's a big train, isn't it? So we must have sat in different carriages before tonight. They both laughed. Listen, Tony continued, I'm going to give you a choice, and I won't take no for an answer. We can either go to a nice little pub for a drink, or we can get a couple of bottles of wine and go back to my place. Now, which is it to be? She let out a giggle of disbelief. You don't waste time, do you? No, but you will be if you don't make up your mind quickly. She seemed suddenly unsure. Oh, I don't know, Tony. I mean, it's been a great night, but don't you think we're pushing it a bit? We've only just met each other, and how am I going to get home? Oh, don't worry about that, he said, waving his hand as if shooing the triviality away. I've got a spare room. I know, but, he interrupted her. Did you hear me when I said I wouldn't take no for an answer? It was he who downed most of the wine from the 2 bottles. She seemed content with 1 glassful and made it last the night. It was well after midnight, and Tony had slowly allowed the wine to go to his head. They had talked for hours, sitting facing each other across the coffee table in his flat, and Denise had enjoyed it. She felt calm and at ease with this man, this stranger whom she had met only a few hours earlier. As the time drew close to 1 a.m., Tony held up what remained of the 2nd bottle. There was only an inch of wine in the bottom now. Here. He leaned across and tried to fill her glass, but she covered it with her hand. What's wrong? You've hardly drunk anything all night. She smiled. I'm fine. I don't drink much anyway. He shrugged and drained the bottle into his glass. Suit yourself. I wouldn't mind a black coffee, though. He nodded, then put the bottle down on the table and stood, steadying himself momentarily as the effects of the wine took him by surprise. He grinned down at her, coming right up. She watched him turn and move unsteadily into the kitchen, out of sight. Heard the kettle being filled and the cups clinking. Her gaze fell to the newspaper on the coffee table, and she smiled to herself, reminded of their meeting only hours before. She reached out and picked it up. It was still a little damp from the rain, but the headline on the front page loomed out at her. She read on. All 3 murders are identical. The victims were respectable young men with decent office jobs. A smile broke across her lips as she read the next lines. They were stabbed repeatedly in their own homes, and the police strongly suspect that the victims knew their killer and willingly allowed them inside, as there were no signs of forced entry. Trying her best to fight back the laughter, Denise leant forwards and quietly opened her handbag. Reaching inside, she curled her fingers around the large kitchen knife and slowly pulled it out, dazzled momentarily as the overhead light glinted off the wickedly sharp blade. Then she rose to her feet. Her pulse racing, pounding inside her skull like a steam engine, she tightened her grip on the knife's handle. and her one and only thought as she stepped silently into the kitchen was that of tomorrow's newspaper headlines. Serial killer at large. Victim number 4 found.